Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has stepped up his criticism of former President Donald Trump. DeSantis made I'm trying.
I mean, that's how he used to say it. That's how his parents say it, right?
No, I'm telling you, it's how he said it in his campaign video. I'm trying to say his name the way he says it.
The way his parents
makes no
said
sense,
it.
though.
DeSantis makes sense, right?
DeSantis made appearances in 4 different towns in Iowa yesterday, touting his efforts to push Florida farther to the right. While he never mentioned Trump by name during his speeches, DeSantis criticized the former president's policies, saying he would have gotten rid of Anthony Fauci during the pandemic and would have closed the border.
Leadership, at the end of the day, it's not about entertainment. It's not about building a brand. It's not about virtue signaling. It's about producing results. You really need a very disciplined, energetic president willing to spit nails and fight the needed battles every single day for 8 years. You can't get cowed by the left. You can't worry about what the legacy media says. You need to be willing to clean house on day one. And so that means, if you have a problematic bureaucrat like a Fauci, you don't elevate Fauci. You bring him in, tell him to pack his bags. You are fired, and you have to be willing to do that.
It's so funny. He talks about.
Terrific.
He says you actually do things. You don't virtue signal. Virtually everything he says publicly is virtue signaling. He goes after one phony issue after another. Virtue signals about it. He brings up Anthony Fauci. Virtue signals about that. He virtue signals about Disney. He virtue signals about books. He virtue signals about all of these other things. It's all about virtue signaling. He doesn't talk about inflation. I haven't heard him talking. The thing is, what about focusing on jobs? What about focusing on inflation?
Guns?
What about focusing on a lot of other issues, Well, now that, I've got to say, with abortion, that's something he did that was very real. He has completely impacted the lives of women in Florida and will over time stop businesses from coming to the state of Florida if they have a choice to go somewhere else where you don't have an almost absolute ban on abortion. Now, DeSantis did mention the former president while talking to reporters later, questioning the former president's commitment to conservatism. He called out Trump for siding with Disney in his feud with the entertainment company, saying his Republican rival's position is, quote, bizarre. Let's go right now to Des Moines, and we have senior writer for the Dispatch, David Drucker. David, we've all been asking, everybody's been asking, when are people going to actually go after Trump by name? He did it yesterday, talking about how Trump's entire family moved to Florida. If it was such a horrible state, he was doing a horrible job. Why did your entire family move to Florida? A good question. And yesterday, he was quite direct going after Donald Trump. I think maybe we're starting to see a new phase of the campaign where it actually looks like a traditional campaign instead of somebody going around patting Donald Trump on the head all day.
Yeah, this looks a lot different, Joe and Mika, than 2016, and a lot different than 2024 has looked up until now. Becoming a candidate, Ron DeSantis has clearly unleashed himself when it comes to the former president. And look, strategically, I think he's doing it correctly so far. When you talk to voters in Iowa, which I've done the past couple of days, and I've been doing repeatedly over the past couple of months, they want a Republican that focuses on the future and focuses on a lot of these cultural issues that are very important to them. But when confronted with questions about his rival, they want a candidate who's willing to stand up and just be blunt and honest about it and not shy away from that. And that's what the governor is doing so far. So, look, he's got to come from behind. We'll see if he can run a competent campaign. We'll see if voters really take to him. But so far, it's been really interesting to watch in 2 ways. One, he's not a very dynamic speaker, but the audiences are eating up the content of his speeches. And what he's able to do, which is different than a lot of senators that I've covered, instead of saying, I've proposed legislation, he's able to say, I signed this into law, and that carries a lot of weight here. Secondly, this is just very different. Usually, when a political spouse is involved in a campaign, male or female, they will introduce the candidate, and then they step to the side, and they're done. And so far, what Governor DeSantis likes to do with his wife, the First Lady of Florida, Casey DeSantis, is she comes up in the middle of his speech. He invites her up. She gives a mini speech, a riff of her own for about 5-10 minutes. Then she steps back down into the audience, and he continues on with the rest of his speech. It's stylistically different. The audience is like her, and she has all of the charm and the savvy that he doesn't always appear to have. And I think he understands that she is a very impotent weapon for his campaign, and I think that's why he's involving her the way he has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's definitely an asset to his campaign. David, the book on Ron DeSantis, and not just from the national media, but from the media in Tallahassee and politicians, Republicans included in the state of Florida, is that he's just, as you sort of alluded to, not real comfortable in that room doing the retail politics and the glad handing and the schmoozing and all the things that you have to do to earn votes in a place like Iowa. As you watch him on the campaign trail, is that a fair assessment of the kind of politician he is?
Well, it's a fair assessment of the kind of politician he has been up until recently. Look, my reporting from Tallahassee a couple of months ago delved deep into this, and I had a lot of Republicans in the Florida Capitol question whether he was going to do this, right? I mean, if he was going to run for president, was he going to stick around in the room and shake hands and pose for selfies? Because he didn't like to do it. He didn't like to do any of it. He's not a small talker. He's not a kibitzer, but he is doing it. I will say, Willie, I've watched him now a couple of weeks ago in Iowa. I've watched him the past couple of days. He's working the room, he's hanging out, and getting back to his wife, just because I think it's an important factor here. She also does it. They work opposite ends of the room. They have almost equal crowds around them for handshakes, selfies, and comments after the speech. And so he understands, presumably, that this is what you need to do if you want to win, and he's doing what is required to put himself in a position to win.
Jonathan Lemire, I think one of the reasons why, even after the Twitter launch, I thought that Ron DeSantis had a chance to catch up with Donald Trump is there's something else about him. You hear him talk, and again, yes, there's just a lot of virtue signaling. He looks at the polls. He sees what the most hardcore part of the base wants, and he gives them that. He also can, I mean, this sounds simple, but I can tell you for an exhausted Republican Party that's had to deal with Donald Trump, he can speak in complete sentences. He's articulate. He can string.
It's the contrast.
He can string. You're right. Sentences, paragraphs together, and it is the contrast. So he's not a glad hander. I got to say, Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush was uncomfortable around people. Of course, he knew how to. He knew how to do what he needed to do, but he wasn't like his brother in that way. But Jeb was a policy guy, and Jeb got up and talked policy, man. You knew exactly where he wanted to take the state, and people really responded to that to a big way. I've got to say, with Ron DeSantis, I think sometimes we're all focused so much on what he can't do, which is he can't glad hand like W. He can't glad hand like Reagan. That we don't focus on what he is doing and what audiences in Iowa and New Hampshire and the early states are going to see. And that's a guy who's smart, a guy who can actually deliver a speech and answer questions in a way that resembles, again, some semblance of logic. That's something Donald Trump just still to this day can't really do. He insults somebody, he has a little punchline, and that's about it.
Yeah, if you look at a transcript of a DeSantis speech, it is coherent. A transcript of a Trump one, very different. And you're right, that is something he can do. He also, to David's point, can point to a record of things he has done with executive power there in Florida. He's also raised a lot of money. Despite that the glitchy launch last week on Twitter, his campaign has said they've bankrolled a ton of cash. And we know that he's caught Donald Trump's attention, who is pounding him multiple times a day on Truth Social. Speaking of DeSantis' name, he started attacking the DeSantis or DeSantis. He's also started calling him Rob for some reason. My sense is that was a typo, and now he's just going with it. But that is a defining dynamic in this race right now. But David Drucker, the field's about to grow. Mike Pence is going to be where you are in Iowa sometime next week. He's going to announce his campaign. Chris Christie's going to do the same in New Hampshire. Give us your sense of the field right here as it grows more crowded. The conventional wisdom has been that's good for Trump. What sort of lanes can Pence and Christie find?
Well, we will find out. Look, Governor Christie has not wanted to run unless he thought he could mount a viable campaign. He's told me many times, staying at a Holiday Inn Express, it's just not glamorous enough to do this, just to go on a kamikaze mission to take down Trump. But he is going to, I think, sort of sequester himself in New Hampshire, focus on the front runner who remains Trump for now, and see if he can make some headway. Mike Pence, I think, is going to be interesting to watch in this regard. There are a lot of Republicans and Democrats I talk to all the time, usually in Washington, but also around the country, who say, what happened to the Ronald Reagan version of the Republican Party that I liked so much? And that's how Mike Pence is going to run, both on issues and temperament. And we'll see if there's a market for that in the Republican Party in these early states such that he can become a contender. He also will not shy away from criticizing the front runner, although he tends to conduct his politics in a little bit more of a civil manner. And so we'll see how that works out for him. The conventional wisdom, as you say, Jonathan, is that the more crowded this gets, the better it is for Trump. The Trump campaign certainly feels that way. And that could end up being the case. I think the real question is it crowded when it starts voting, when voters start going to the polls in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, or does it thin out again as people try to mount campaigns and fail? Also, is this a little bit different? And I will tell you from a donor aspect, one way it is different is this. In 2016, different Republican donors were picking their favorite candidates, and they were making sure their coffers were full so they could get to the starting line. This time around, a lot of Republican donors are keeping their powder dry. They don't want to keep candidates in the race that don't have a chance to win and help Trump. And some of those donors may actually back candidates they don't necessarily like all that much, as long as they feel like that candidate is on the rise and is in a position to beat Donald Trump. So we'll just have to see how this plays out in the coming months.